Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at an interview with Keaton Halley on the Creation Ministries International channel. In this video, he supposedly debunks 5 common atheist arguments. I have my doubts, so let's take a look.
What do I do if I hear an objection to Christianity that I don't know how to answer?
Right.
That was not my cut. That's how they edited that. So what do you do if there's an objection you can't answer? Hard cut away from that objection and try not to think about it. I know that was from the intro and they're just trying to give us a hook that'll keep people watching to see that point come up later, but it was just too perfect for me to not use here.
And again, I would say these arguments all actually do have fundamental logical flaws. And so it's important for us to understand those to give Christians confidence that they don't need to be intimidated by these challenges. But also, I would say that atheists can learn from this and really stop using these bad arguments and either find better ones or maybe give up your atheism. That's my hope.
Here's the thing with that. I'm not an atheist because I chose to become an atheist, nor am I holding on to atheism because I want to be an atheist. Becoming convinced that a God exists would not be me giving up atheism, it would be me becoming convinced that a God exists. Christians, on the other hand, are very much motivated to stay Christian. Not only is there the promise of eternal happiness, but in this life, chances are your friends and family are also Christian, and a lot of the times, losing your Christianity results in the loss of your friends and family as well. That's why I pretended to still be Christian for about a year after becoming an atheist. I was afraid of the social repercussions of no longer being a member of the dominant religion in my country. Now, I am in a bit of a weird spot. Being an atheist YouTuber is literally my job, so I am somewhat financially motivated to stay atheist, but for most atheists, at least in North America, their lives would likely become significantly easier if they were converted to Christianity. The fact that atheism is on the rise in spite of the social benefits of being Christian should tell us something about how convincing these arguments are.
Okay, well, tell us a little bit about your faith. Have you always believed in God?
At least as long as I can remember. It's interesting. There are scientific studies of children raised in atheist homes that show even many of these children not taught about God, they naturally form a belief in God anyway.
Shame that he doesn't actually cite any of these studies. I'd like more information. If these studies are on kids raised in atheist homes in the United States, then that's not really surprising. As an atheist, while I am avoiding indoctrinating my kids into religion, if they become religious at some point in their lives, that won't change our relationship, and they know that. So when they go out into the world and become exposed to these ideas, there's nothing stopping them from even considering them in the first place. Whereas a kid raised as a Christian has had it drilled into their head since birth that they need Jesus to get to eternal paradise, so there's extra motivation to reject the ideas that conflict with their belief. But of course, those of you who know me won't be surprised that I went looking for these studies anyway, even though he didn't cite them, and indeed I found a couple. There is a Web 2.0 looking blog post that an article on Vox said was a study, which examined Pew Research data and found that only 30% of people raised as atheists remain atheists as adults, compared to 50 to 75% remaining in the childhood religion for most of the major Christian denominations. And yeah, if I assume those numbers are accurate, that does mean that, percentage-wise, Christians are better at indoctrinating their kids than atheists are. I don't know about you, but I consider it a good thing that my kids will feel more free to explore their spirituality than they would if I raised them Christian. But also, if we think in terms of absolute numbers, according to the latest religious landscape study, atheists make up 5% of the American population, while Christians make up 62%. So that's 17 million atheists and 212 million Christians. Now, I know this crude calculation is not going to be accurate to reality, but it does serve to illustrate the scale of what's going on here. If 70% of the atheists convert to something, notably the data from the other surveys didn't specify what they became other than atheists, so a good chunk of them likely went to a category other than Christian, but if we assume that 70% of the atheists turn Christian, then that's 11.9 million new Christians. But if we take one of the highest numbers for Christian retention and assume that only 30% deconvert, that's 63.6 million apostates. So despite the fact that atheists tend not to indoctrinate their kids with the intention of forcing them to remain lifelong atheists, the atheist category will continue to grow as more Christians deconvert. And yes, I recognize that the same issue is present in the 30% apostasy rate as with the 70% conversion rate. Not all apostates will find themselves as atheists. That being said, it is a fact that Christianity is losing members to apostasy at much higher rates than any other religion, and the unaffiliated category is gaining most of them.
And this is consistent with what we read in the Bible in Romans 1 that says God's existence is actually obvious from the things that he's made.
And what does it say about that verse that, when looking at the raw numbers, significantly more people leave Christianity than join it, and the vast majority of those who leave wind up in the unaffiliated category?
We look at creation and we see that there must be a creator. And so I think that idea influenced me as a young boy, but I was also raised in a Christian home. So my parents taught me about God, and I even believed in the gospel message from the time I was 7 years old.
To paraphrase, I came to believe in the Christian God just by examining nature. It had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that my parents spent my childhood drilling the gospel into my head. Color me unconvinced.
But at the same time, I don't believe in Christianity blindly or merely because of my upbringing. I could see, even as a boy, that there are good reasons to believe in God. And I was sort of a critical thinker who always asked that question, how do I know this is really true?
When I was 7 years old, I had a bout of diarrhea. I proudly came out of the washroom and declared to my whole family that I had just peed out of my butt like girls do. 7-year-olds are clearly amazing at using their critical thinking skills to figure out the deeper truths of the world.
It's really obvious that God exists, and those who don't believe in him, I think, are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, as Romans also talks about.
And that is where we get the whole "you're only an atheist because you want to sin" line. And while there is something to be said for not having to worry about whether Big Brother in the sky is watching your every moves, pretending he doesn't exist when you actually do believe in him is not how you get away with living in sin. You do that by believing in him and repenting, because Jesus can forgive any sin. If I really believed in God and just wanted to sin, being Christian is the best way to accomplish that.
It astonishes me that some people will say there's just no evidence that God is real. And to me, that's sad because it just shows that they're unaware of the many powerful arguments that intelligent people, scholars and philosophers and theologians have been talking about for not just centuries, but millennia, frankly.
Okay, but regardless of what Cameron Bertuzzi would tell you, arguments are not actually evidence. The farthest an argument can get you is, it is not logically impossible for God to exist. In order for an argument to get past that point, it has to be supported by evidence, but an argument by itself is not evidence.
They don't deny that the world looks to be designed, that the sort of initial explanation that, as I mentioned earlier, even children conclude that God is real from looking at the things that have been made.
Yeah, well, children also conclude that girls pee out their butts. If something is so simple that even a child can understand it, then it's likely an oversimplification at best. Now, I'm going to skip the rest of the arguments for God section, because that's not what I came here for.
So let's go ahead and get into the first one. And I think it had to do with who created God.
Okay, yes. Now, this is a question that sometimes children innocently ask just because they're curious, and it's a good question to address. But it is surprising to me how some even prominent atheists like Richard Dawkins, maybe the world's most famous atheist today.
He's only the world's most famous atheist today because you lot can't shut up about him. I'm honestly sick of hearing about him. I would be happy for him to just fade into obscurity.
Years ago, when I read his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which that title refers to evolution, he thinks that you don't need a watchmaker to make watches, comparing this to living things. Living things are like the watch. He says, no, that appearance of design can be explained away by evolution. But before I read the book, I assumed he would marshal all these scientific arguments to make the case that evolution is fact. Instead, his book was largely one sustained argument that was more philosophical in nature, and it has to do with this question of, well, where did God come from? If God is the creator of the universe and of living things, then somebody must have made him as well.
I don't remember much about that book, but yeah, it's not so much about the simplistic question of who created God, it's more about the explanation for God. Apologists will say that the existence of the universe requires an explanation. God is that explanation. So that leaves the atheist wondering, why is it that God does not require an explanation? This is a question that is usually answered with an appeal to the property of necessity by the more philosophically minded apologists, but that just leaves us wondering why God has that property. And as far as I can tell, it boils down to because that's how we defined him. So it's not a question of who created God, it's a question of why all the logical reasoning that concludes with God doesn't also apply to God, and why apologists get to define the God that they like while arbitrarily dismissing things like Gay Unicorn Gary, the all-powerful creator of everything who has the property of necessity and has placed inside all sapient creatures the desire to participate in gay orgies, and those who claim not to have this desire are just denying the truth in their unrighteousness. Gary has the property of necessity. He is all-powerful. He created everything. He's even omnibenevolent and allows suffering in this world for both character building and for reasons that are beyond human understanding. But apologists will dismiss Gary simply because I sell his holy merchandise at merch.vicerhino.com. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, that's the wrong picture. I have no idea how all that Christian merch got in there. Here's Gary's merch. Don't worry, it comes in other colors than white, and it doesn't engage in blatant copyright infringement like a lot of the Christian merch does. I actually really want to do a Gay Unicorn Gary plushie. I've looked into what that would take, and it seems fairly straightforward. I just need a few 100,000 more subscribers, then a company will approach me and offer it, and after a year or two in development, I can do a limited run of $50 plushies with $45 of shipping, of course. Easy peasy. Let's get it done by Christmas. Now, obviously, it's not only on the grounds that I sell his merch that they'll dismiss Gary. It's more likely to be the claim that I made him up whole cloth. But I would argue that the Christian God was also made up by people. The Christian God specifically I'd put mostly on Paul's shoulders. He's certainly the guy who wrote more of the Bible than any other single author, Old or New Testament. From the atheist perspective, it looks like the only way to be taken seriously by apologists is for your God to have been made up a long time ago. But the thing is, I didn't make Gary up. He revealed himself to me. But that doesn't matter. I'm not some guy from 2,000 years ago, so it doesn't count.
But the simple answer, in one sense, or the first thing that I want to point out in response to this question is there is a built-in assumption to the question. It's called a complex question. The assumption is that God did have a creator. So if somebody puts it just like that, who created God, I will say, well, why are you assuming that someone created God?
And why are you assuming that someone created the universe?
Because the Christian doesn't believe this, right? We believe what the Bible teaches, that God is eternal.
And there are many cosmological models of the universe that posit the universe as being functionally eternal. The Hartle-Hawking model comes immediately to mind, which suggests that at the point of the singularity, space-time breaks down to a point where you have space but no time, meaning that space is eternal in the sense that it has existed for all of time, and time has existed for about 13.8 billion years. Scientifically speaking, the universe does not need a creator. It can have existed eternally, and that is supported with not just theoretical physics, but observations about how the laws of physics operate today, as well as observing things like the cosmic microwave background radiation. God is not necessary to explain the universe. And yet, apologists appeal to God as the explanation for the universe on the grounds that everything needs a cause, but God doesn't need a cause, despite being a part of the set of things known as everything, because God is eternal. Why is God eternal? Because the guys who made him up and wrote the book about him thousands of years ago said so. This is where the cosmological arguments fail. The most popular one nowadays is the Kalam, which states that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause. God did not begin to exist, so God does not need a cause. But the people who study the origins of the universe are divided on whether or not it had a beginning in the sense meant by this argument. So it is entirely possible that the universe did not have a beginning, and so does not need a cause, according to this argument.
And notice the atheist doesn't believe that God had a creator either, because he doesn't even believe God is real.
Ah, yes, of course. Atheists don't believe God is real, so even atheists admit that God didn't have a creator. Therefore, God doesn't have a creator. Impeccable logic there.
So why does the question assume God had a creator when nobody in the discussion believes that he did?
I think apologists are just completely incapable of understanding what a thought experiment is. If we hypothetically grant the existence of God for the sake of a thought experiment, that leaves us with a question of what the explanation for God's existence would be. We find that the explanation also potentially applies to the universe itself, rendering God unnecessary, so we see no reason to conclude that a God exists. But no, instead we should just accept that God doesn't need an explanation because if he doesn't exist, then he doesn't need an explanation because he doesn't exist, right? Therefore it's fine if he exists without an explanation. It's more than a little absurd.
But of course, what's implied, that what they're really getting at, Maybe a more sophisticated questioner might ask, if the universe requires a creator, then why doesn't God? Are we just sort of being arbitrary in saying that the universe must have a cause, but God doesn't require a cause or a creator?
Oh my, Gary, he does know the real question. He just pretends like most people mean the first one. Okay, spit it out. How do you respond to the actual question?
Because we're not claiming that everything that exists must have had a cause. Rather, things that begin to exist, those certainly require a cause.
And it is unclear at this time whether or not the universe is included in the category of things that begin to exist. So it moves back into the realm of the arbitrary.
And it is clear that the universe began to exist.
It is clear that space-time began expanding about 13.8 billion years ago. What happened before then is significantly less clear, and many models do not have a beginning in the sense that is meant by this argument. But also, these guys are young Earth creationists. They are in denial about the vast majority of the scientific research and observations that led us to the conclusion that the Big Bang happened. He is currently relying on science that he does not accept in order to make his case. The same calculations that tell us that the Big Bang happened also tell us when it happened, and they don't like that conclusion, so they gloss over that fact while still clinging to the idea of the universe having a beginning so that they can make their argument. It's more than a bit disingenuous.
Even many atheists recognize this today because of things like the law of entropy, which is what I already talked about as the second law of thermodynamics. The universe is winding down, therefore it can't have existed from all eternity. So it's clear the universe must have had a cause to bring it into being. Things just don't pop into being inexplicably without a cause, right? But by contrast, Christians have always taught, the Bible has always claimed that God is eternal. And so given that, it's not obvious that he requires a cause. So there is an asymmetry between God and the universe in that respect.
Exactly what I said. We defined God in a way that makes a cause for him unnecessary. Therefore, a cause for him is unnecessary. There's nothing to support this idea other than what human beings have said about God. No observations, no calculations. Hell, we can't even get this Godfeller to actually come down here and make that claim for himself. It's only ever what people say about him, which just so happens to line up with what one would expect if it turned out that God doesn't exist as anything more than a concept created by human beings.
And one other thing to point out is I think this is intellectually satisfying because I'm not saying that God, therefore, is just a brute fact, that he has no explanation for why he exists.
Aren't you, though? A brute fact, philosophically speaking, is just a fact which has no more fundamental explanation. To say that God has always existed and requires no explanation is to assert that God is a brute fact, because that's what those words mean.
There was a brilliant mathematician and philosopher from a few centuries ago named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz.
Oh, so we're just going to end up at the Leibnizian ontological argument then, aren't we? Well, I despise the ontological argument because it just boils down to essentially what I've already been saying here. We define God as existing, therefore God exists. So I'm going to skip ahead again, but I will leave a link to a video where I covered the ontological argument in more depth. I just don't want to do it again because I hate it. It's the worst.
Yeah.
Well, what about the second one that has to do with Christians are really atheists?
Sure. And sometimes it's put like this, that we are atheists with respect to all the other gods besides the one that we believe in, Horus and Vishnu and so forth. And therefore, the atheists say, we just believe in one less God than you do.
Before he gets into it, my bet is that he's going to dismiss this because an atheist, by definition, believes in 0 gods, and a Christian believes in 1. So they cannot be an atheist, rather than engaging with the point being made that the vast majority of Christians have not, in any meaningful way, considered that the God they believe in might not be the right one, and so have no real reason to have concluded that the Christian God is actually the real one. It's a statement that is meant to provoke you into thinking about why you reject the other gods, and to encourage you to apply that same reasoning to the one you don't reject to see whether or not he still holds up.
Now, if it's only an assertion without drawing out any implications of that statement, I suppose I can agree with the statement. It's true that I believe in one more God than the atheists. But I think what they're really getting at is to say that, therefore, there's no profound difference between us, and you may as well give up in your belief in God altogether then.
Damn it, I was wrong. He's pretty close to getting it, though. He's just pointing his critical thinking in the wrong direction. It's not that there's no profound difference between being an atheist and being a Christian, it's that there's no profound difference in believing in one God versus another. So maybe you should critically examine why it is you believe in the God that you do.
But that just doesn't follow from the starting point. I would also quibble with the use of language there to say I'm an atheist with respect to. The term atheist really just is a denial that any gods exist. So I don't think it's proper to call me an atheist with respect to a particular god.
Damn it! I was wrong about being wrong. Hooray for double negatives?
And so a good analogy for this might be, consider the difference between a married man and a bachelor. The difference between them is just one wife, right? But would we say that a married man is actually a bachelor with respect to the vast majority of women that have ever existed? No, that's kind of an abuse of the term bachelor, right? But more importantly, it shows that there is a profound difference between having no wife at all and one wife. And it doesn't follow from the difference between just one that the married man should treat his wife as if she doesn't exist or just get rid of her, right? No.
Well, he's getting kind of close, isn't he? A person's wife can be demonstrated to actually exist. And in this analogy, all of the other women in the world also exist, and many of them could be potentially valid options for our hypothetical bachelor. And there will undoubtedly be reasons that this bachelor chose to marry one particular woman, and when you apply that reasoning to the other women in the world, then assuming he made a good choice and they're actually compatible, then that reasoning would suggest that the other women would be less optimal choices for matrimony. So what we're asking you to do is actually sit down and scrutinize other gods, and once you've done that, turn that scrutiny on your own god to see if he still stands out as the one who actually passes the test. Because the thing is, to us atheists, Christians all have the appearance of a bachelor who insists that, yeah, they have a girlfriend, but you wouldn't know her, she lives in Canada.
In the same way, there is a profound difference between atheists and Christians and the implications of whether the God we believe in, who is not one of these finite gods like Vishnu and Zeus, but he is the transcendent, almighty, all-knowing creator of all things and the ground for moral goodness.
Why would you assume that Vishnu is finite? Vishnu is part of the trinity responsible for the cyclical creation, maintenance, and then destruction of the universe in Hinduism. I'm not terribly familiar with Hindu beliefs, but that sounds pretty infinite to me. It's even got a trinity, just like in Christianity, except they will freely admit that they believe in multiple gods, whereas Christians try to pretend like the three distinct gods are only one god somehow. Zeus had a mother and a father, so I'll grant that that one is finite, but I'm sure if you go back far enough in the mythology, you do arrive at a being that is a brute fact in the same way as the Christian god. But once again, the point is to get you thinking about why you don't believe in those gods and what is different about your god. Clearly, this guy is not familiar enough with the third largest religion in the world to be able to answer those questions, which then says to me that he has not seriously considered the possibility that he might be wrong. If you haven't seriously considered the possibility that you might be wrong, then why should I assume that you are right?
You think of somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche and his famous parable of the madman, where he uses this to say that society has killed God in the sense that we've kind of abandoned belief in him, but the people in the parable don't believe in God, and yet they haven't yet realized the profound ramifications this has for society. You can't have the fruit of Christianity if you undermine the roots.
And I disagree with good old Freddie Nitz on that point, assuming you are correctly representing his viewpoints. I read through the parable, and that does seem to be what he was driving at, but his writings are complicated to interpret. Sometimes it can be difficult to tell where he was being serious and where he was being satirical. But as it turns out, all of that is irrelevant, because as can be found reported in the bastion of atheism known as Christian Today, the happiest countries in the world are ones where most people do not consider religion to be an important part of their lives, and they use income, healthy life expectancy, social support, freedom, trust, and generosity as the metrics by which they measure happiness. So yeah, given that secular societies tend to make for happier people, it stands to reason that the fruit of Christianity that is being undermined is unhappiness.
And so, yeah, I'm not going to abandon my belief in God just because the atheists point out I don't believe in other gods.
Nobody is asking you to. What we are asking is that you apply the same level of skepticism to your God as you do the other gods. If your God is actually the real one, then this should leave your faith intact. But until you even consider the possibility of being skeptical of your God, your faith lacks grounding.
So the challenge goes like this. Can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it?
And this is where we fiddle with definitions again. As it turns out, all-powerful doesn't actually mean that God can do anything. It actually means that God can only do anything that is logically possible. Since creating a rock that is so heavy that even he can't lift it is a logical impossibility, then the answer is no, he cannot, but he's still omnipotent. I would argue that this means that God is subservient to the laws of logic. They are the ultimate arbiter of what can or cannot be done. Sure, apologists will claim that the laws of logic flow from God's nature, but given that the Christian apologists in particular believe in a God that violates at least two of the three fundamental laws of logic, the law of identity and law of non-contradiction, I don't think that's even possible. The law of identity is that a thing is identical with itself. A equals A. The law of non-contradiction is that a proposition cannot be both true and not true simultaneously. So for God, we have three beings: God the Father, Jesus his Son, and the Holy Ghost. They are distinct entities. God the Father is not Jesus. Jesus is not the Holy Ghost, and the Holy Ghost is not God the Father. But God the Father is holy God, Jesus is also holy God, and the Holy Ghost is holy God. It's a lot of fucking holies. And yet, they are distinct from each other. So we have a conundrum where all three of these distinct beings are holy God, but are not each other. A equals D, B equals D, and C equals D, but A does not equal B or C. Since a thing is identical with itself, A equals D can be rewritten as D equals D, and the same for B and C, which then leaves us with a violation of the law of non-contradiction. If they all equal D, but do not equal each other, then we're left at a place where D equals D, but simultaneously, D does not equal D. And this is the Trinity, God's nature. How can the laws of logic be grounded in God's nature when God's nature is itself a violation of the laws of logic?
I believe the true answer is that no, God could not make a rock so big that he can't lift it. But sometimes when we're speaking in, simple language, we might say that God being omnipotent means that he can do anything, or he can do all things.
Does the Bible not plainly say, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible? It doesn't say with God all logically possible things are possible. It says all things. Do you disagree with the Bible? And those are the words of Jesus, so this isn't even just the Bible. This is God himself telling you that he can do all things, not just that which is logically possible. Now, sure, this is a rather simplistic view of Scripture, but again, this dude is a young Earth creationist. He thinks there was literally a talking snake tricking humans into eating a fruit that would somehow magically impart the knowledge of good and evil into their brains, because that is what a simplistic reading of the Genesis story would suggest. So if he can find his way to nuance when it comes to the literal words of Jesus, Herschel, Christ himself, why would he not be able to see nuance in a clearly mythological creation account from earlier in the Bible?
And what we typically mean by that is not strictly literally speaking true. Rather, God's omnipotence means that God can do anything power can do. But I can think of plenty of things that God is not capable of doing. For example, we already talked about how God exists necessarily. That means God cannot fail to exist.
One of my favorite responses to the ontological argument is regarding the property of maximal greatness. A maximally great being has all the properties that it is better to have than not to have. What these properties are is up for debate and seems rather arbitrary and opinion-driven, so that is a big red flag for me. But a property that is better to have than not to have and seems in keeping with the character of God found in the Bible is impressiveness. And all else being equal, doing something impressive is more impressive if it's accomplished with a handicap of some kind. For example, look at the Turkish guy who took home the silver in the 10-meter air pistol event in the 2024 Summer Olympics. The reason he went viral is because he didn't use the high-tech shooting glasses that the other Olympians were using. Everyone was impressed with him because he was seen as being more impressive because he won silver without the same level of help as his competition. And I would be willing to bet that the majority of people watching this have no idea who won gold for that event, because the guy who did it at a disadvantage is more impressive. Back to the ontological argument, it seems then that being more impressive would involve having a larger handicap. Creating a universe is impressive, sure, but doing so while not being omnipotent? That's a bit more impressive. Most impressive of all would be to create the universe with the biggest handicap of all, that of non-existence. So a maximally great being, by virtue of being maximally impressive, does not exist.
He can't cease to exist. He can't stop being God. He can't commit evil acts, right? God is perfectly good,
Well, according to the Bible, God committed genocide at least once and commanded it several times. So if this definition of God holds true, then the God that exists is not your God, because that God at least sometimes commits evil acts.
And so a proper understanding of God's being all-powerful means that he can do anything power can do. Power is not capable of doing logical contradictions, for example.
Because the laws of logic are more powerful than God, you see.
And so, God can't make a square circle, which is just a meaningless combination of words.
Oh, where are my non-Euclidean folks at? Because as it turns out, you can make a square circle in non-Euclidean space with a constant negative Gaussian curvature. What the fuck does any of that mean? No idea. The math is more than a bit beyond me, I'm afraid.
And so that's no threat to Christianity to say that God can't do something. It's not a weakness in God. It's actually a strength.
Yeah, God not being able to do something actually makes him more omnipotent if you think about it. Sure thing, buddy.
Now, I've had atheists put this question to me personally in private conversations. They say, well, you are perhaps only a Christian because you were raised in a Christian culture in the Western world where Christianity is very prevalent.
Yes, you were born into a Christian household, raised in a majority Christian country, and are now a Christian. Had you been born to Muslim parents in a Muslim majority country, you would most likely be Muslim. Same for Hindu, same for Buddhist, etc., etc., etc. That's the pattern we would expect to see if there was no one true religion. But if one actually is true, and on top of that is the one where the God of that religion wants a personal relationship with everyone, then the expectation would be that the religion of that God does not follow that pattern and can instead be found popping up everywhere, even in places that have no prior exposure to it, as God reveals himself to those people. But since all religions spread in the way we would expect them to if none of them were true, it seems like the conclusion, none of them are true, is a reasonable one.
But had you been born in, say, Saudi Arabia or another Muslim country, isn't it likely that you would be a Muslim?
Extremely likely.
Well, there are a couple of responses I want to give to that challenge. The main problem with it is really, it's not dealing with the evidence for and against Christianity. It's actually changing the subject to something that is irrelevant to the heart of the issue.
If it were actually irrelevant, then you would be right. It would be a nice little example of whataboutism. But the Bible says that God wants a personal relationship with everyone, and that he is not willing that any should perish, but wants all to have eternal life. And yet he allows his religion to spread through the same mechanisms as all the religions that are not true? This suggests that maybe his religion is also not true. Thus, it is entirely relevant.
But before I get to that aspect, let me actually say first, I'm not sure I even buy into the premise of the challenge, because it treats it as though I've concluded that Christianity is true merely because of an accident of history, and I'm sort of helpless and powerless against the culture that has influenced me to think the way that I do.
Just a reminder that at the beginning of the video, he acknowledged that his parents have been teaching him about Christianity his whole life, and that he accepted the gospel at the ripe old age of 7. Sure, he said that he believed in God because nature makes God's existence obvious, but would he have thought that if his parents hadn't drilled it into his head from birth? Unlikely, given the statistics. The strongest predictor of your religion is, in fact, your parents' religion.
That's not necessarily the case.
You already all but admitted that it was the case for you.
The Bible even gives me reason to challenge that assumption. For example, in Acts 17, the Apostle Paul, when he's speaking to some of the Greek philosophers in Athens, he says to them that God has determined the different places and times in which people live, which nation that he places them in order that people would reach out, seek God, and find him, even though he's not that far from each one of us.
Well, in that case, Islam must be true. Because while Christians are still holding on to a slim worldwide majority for the moment, Islam is growing a lot faster than Christianity and is poised to overtake it sometime in the next few decades.
And so God is sovereign over history, and he actually has a say in when I existed and who my parents were and things like this. And so
Oh my goodness, this is what I've been saying every time I do a video that deals with free will. God makes all your choices in advance by tweaking the circumstances of your life and knitting you together in your parents' womb while knowing all of these future outcomes. If that is the case, then God designed history to be such that the vast majority of people to ever exist would wind up being eternally tortured in hell. That doesn't sound like a God that is not willing that any should perish.
I would say for myself personally, I haven't merely allowed culture to influence me. I've tried to critically analyze the truth claims of Christianity, and I think I do have strong intellectual reasons for believing them.
It just so happens that those strong intellectual reasons led to the conclusions you reached when you were 7 years old. How convenient for you. And I'm sure there are people of a myriad of other religions who would say the same thing about them and their religions. This comes back to the "you are atheist to all the other gods" thing. Have you actually critically examined all of the other religions to see if there might just be something to them? Judging by you not understanding Vishnu earlier, I think the answer is no. So it does indeed look like you just stuck with the religion you grew up with.
But let me even concede the point and say, okay, maybe if I had been raised in a Muslim country, I might have turned out to be a Muslim. That's still irrelevant to whether or not Christianity is true. It's not dealing with the evidence itself. It's asking a question about me personally and my psychology.
It's actually meant to highlight the lack of evidence. It's not about you personally. It's about the fact that your religion spreads through demographics, just like all of the other ones, and just like we'd expect if none of them were true.
You know, even if I have poor reasons for believing in Christianity, there still could be good reasons apart from my own beliefs.
My Gary, he's so close. Yes, that's the point. We want you to actually examine those beliefs with a critical eye.
In fact, this is actually, if you consult textbooks on logic, this is a clear case example of a logical fallacy. It's called the genetic fallacy.
The genetic fallacy is when you attack an idea based on its origin rather than the idea itself. The issue here is that the origin of the idea has implications regarding the truth of the idea. If a god wanted to communicate with humanity, we wouldn't expect him to go about it in the way that he supposedly has. And this is supported biblically. So the fact that God's communication with humanity follows the exact same patterns as the so-called communications of all the false gods supports the idea that this god is also a false god and does not exist. It is not merely saying that you personally have bad reasons for believing, therefore your belief is wrong. It's that the actions of the god that you believe in do not line up with what we would expect if the god that you believed in existed.
So like another good example of this would be, there was a famous chemist named Kekulé who was trying to determine the molecular structure of benzene. And the way he figured it out is because he was dreaming one night and had a dream about a snake grasping its own tail. And it occurred to him, oh, maybe benzene is a ring structure. But can anybody say, well, that shows benzene maybe really isn't a ring structure just because this idea originated in the man's dream? No, not at all. Benzene is a ring regardless of how Kekulé came to that conclusion.
True, but we didn't trust his conclusion based solely on his dream. It was verified through other means. Even in his own account, he didn't dream up the structure of the molecule itself. The dream basically made him consider the possibility of a circular molecule rather than another shape. After waking up from that dream, he spent the rest of the night working out the details. But I do find it weird that this is the second apologist over the past couple weeks to be defending the idea that it doesn't matter how you came to believe in Christianity. Having bad reasons for belief is fine, actually. It just seems like quite the admission, really. And this plays into an idea that other atheist YouTubers have articulated better than me. The idea that it doesn't matter how little you understand about Christianity in order for you to join and become a Christian, but if you want to leave or challenge the religion in any way, then suddenly you have to have read every great theologian and philosopher who's ever written on the subject in the last 2,000 years and consult with all the professional apologists to make sure you're properly understanding them. The bar for entry is quite low, but the bar for exit is unreasonably high.
Atheists often appeal to science. I think they tend to see themselves as rationalists and as though science backs up their claims.
It's not so much that science backs up atheism, it's that science has shown that God is not necessary to explain anything in nature, and so God is not a scientific conclusion. This doesn't mean that no God exists, it just means that no God is a necessary part of any scientific explanation for anything.
But in this case, what they're really saying is that the Christian belief in God is merely an appeal to ignorance rather than the best conclusion from the evidence that we have.
Yes, that's what a lot of arguments for God do. For instance, the cosmological argument. We don't understand the origin of the universe, therefore God.
But I would say this is not the way that Christians tend to argue that God is real. We actually do have powerful, strong reasons from science that help to show that.
My whole channel is stuffed to the brim, full of apologists arguing things like, we don't understand the origin of life, therefore God, and we don't understand where morality comes from, therefore God. Creationists in particular are really bad for this. A lot of them seem to think that if they just poke enough holes into the theory of evolution, then their specific brand of young earth creationism will automatically win. So yeah, it's God of the gaps, all the way down.
And so a good analogy in this case is imagine you find a dead body and there are 5 bullet holes in the person's back, and we want to figure out what is it that caused this person's death. Was it just him dying of natural causes? Was it accidental? Or was there design involved? Was it an agent, an intelligent person with a motive who murdered this person? Well, it's kind of obvious just from the facts that I've given you, right?
Not necessarily. It is entirely possible to shoot a corpse in the back. How did you determine that the bullets happened before the death? Sure, in this hypothetical death by shooting is definitely the most likely scenario, but the apparently obvious cause of death is not always the actual cause of death.
Nobody would say that we believe in a murderer of the gaps just because we, assume from the evidence that we have that a murderer was responsible, that it must have been design. Maybe science just hasn't yet discovered the naturalistic explanation for this man's death. We know from our experience that natural processes are not capable of producing effects like bullet holes.
I haven't watched CSI in years, but I used to watch it all the time. And there were a number of episodes where a body was found that had them looking for a murderer, and at the end of the episode, it was just some wild fluke that made everything look suspicious while being entirely natural. So yes, as long as they were hunting for a murderer, they absolutely were believing in a murderer of the gaps. But the analogy for God would work better if the body were found in, say, a body of water, and the cause for death was drowning. Also, this person is known to frequently go fishing in their boat on their own. There is nothing here pointing to foul play, the person just drowned while out on a boat by themselves. But the apologist insists that they were murdered, despite the lack of evidence pointing to a murderer. Sure, it's possible that they were, but it's not indicated by the evidence, and everything can be explained without appealing to a murderer, so we have no reason to conclude that they were murdered.
And so it's the same with the things that God made in the world. Living things, as I mentioned before, exhibit this sophisticated complexity that requires foresight.
Except they really don't. As it turns out, naturalistic explanations are adequate to explain the complexity of life without the need to appeal to a designer. You argue by ignoring that fact, pointing to complexity and saying, we don't know how all that could come about naturally, therefore God. That is exactly a God of the gaps argument.
Not only are natural processes inadequate to account for these specific details of living things, but also in our experience, designers can produce those sorts of effects.
And when you ask a biologist who actually studies this shit for a living, they are likely to tell you that the organisms we are familiar with are very clearly designed by evolutionary mechanisms with zero foresight.
And so we have a positive reason to believe that God is the one responsible. It's not just, we don't know what the cause is yet, therefore let's assume God did it. And notice, by the way, even this admission that there are gaps in our scientific knowledge, then the atheists are really the ones who are guilty here of plugging in the gap with an appeal to blind faith, assuming that they'll one day discover a naturalistic cause will be the answer.
No, this is where the null hypothesis comes in. We don't assume anything about the cause of things that we don't understand. We leave it as inconclusive until it's figured out. I don't know is a valid answer when it is true. And that's basically it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from me. Fuck it. It's my channel. I do what I want. Anyway, when I saw that video of washed up actor Dean Cain training to join ICE, I knew it needed a little something. And that something is a jaunty tuba, so I did this. You're welcome. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Sirs every Wednesday, 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Piper for being my editor, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the participants in the gay orgy that is my channel. If you love to have a good time filled with consent and safe sex practices, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my PO box address is in the description. See you next time! Yeah, so I just spent the last 20 minutes on the floor in my shirt and bow tie putting a friggin' light back together because pieces were falling out of it, so I had to take it apart all the way so that I could put it back together. Y'all need to become patrons so that I can afford to move my office to the garage so I can build a set where I can stand again, because this squeaky chair drives me fucking nuts. Disagree with the Bible? Ooh, excuse me. I'm sorry. Do you... Goddamn. You done? Nope.